Welcome to my cast on Crit Guardian Tank. This build was envisioned solely with the purpose of being, well, tanky. I wanted, of course, always to do damage with my builds, but occasionally, every now, pretty much once a league, I've made a tradition of this, is trying to make a build that is extra thick, something I can use to tank things I shouldn't be able to tank. And this time, we went with this character. It's turned out really well in the tank department, basically only dying to the hardest of hits. We managed to tank up to everything, I think, except for the Maven Brain Bomb. Double Uber Atziri's Flame Blast, of course, was like a 70% survival rate, but still, I'm pretty happy with that considering how well it does when it's being attacked by so much damage, because Aegis Aurora just is that good. The sustain is impeccable. There's a Maven Memory Game. That one's a classic heavy hit that not too many builds can survive. We managed to do it, so it felt good. Now, the build, all in all, ends up feeling pretty good for both clear and single target as well, so I was pretty happy with that. Normally, when I make a tanky build, I've done multiple of these in the past where, frankly, the damage just kinda sucks, and the clear is pretty bad. But this character was able to manage both those things with some investment, of course, given we have invested quite a bit into mana reservation efficiency, enlightens, and such. And besides the mana reservation and the expense of getting enlightens and stuff like that, this was also a heavy time investment character, because every time I switched one piece of gear, you can bet that had an important attribute I needed to match my top two attributes for leadership's price, which would then cause me to rip out my hair. Aside from the inevitable loss of hair, due to re-gearing every time I needed to match my attributes, the build, well, it made up for that. It was a nice, soothing, comfortable, relaxing experience after the pain of ripping out my hair and having to match those attributes. Enough about me and my inevitable baldness. Let's talk about some great features of the build. You can go AFK on a regular basis in dangerous maps. It's just a soothing thing to do. It feels good. Go get yourself a coffee, maybe a tea, a book to read. There's things you can do while sitting in various dangerous environments, and it has a cathartic experience to it. It's something that really feels good on the inside. And, to be honest, it's a stress reliever. Something that would normally be like a worry or a concern because, oh, if I lose 10% of my XP at level 96, there goes an hour of my life, or whatever it was. Now, enough about me and the relaxation of this build. Let's get a second opinion from my friends, who are definitely always very supporting to me and definitely encourage me in my builds and don't make fun of me at all, ever. 100%. Great friends.
And I don't mean the attacks from the enemies. I mean making such a ZDPS build. Somewhere, a tear goes down Quinn's face of joy. Are you just sitting there waiting for all of them to come out? Couldn't even roll all released simultaneously or whatever it is. I'll kill you all one day. To be fair, that one that just died, he's just napping. He's not even dead.
He's just bored.
He's bored. You killed him from boredom. That's it.
He just left.
You bored the hidden to death.
Welcome, Exiles, to the in-game overview of this character. To start things off with, I made a little bit of a breakdown of what this build can and cannot functionally tank, because I tested this sort of stuff. And this is kind of like the breakdown I had. Most content is basically just a joke. You can pretty much just ignore it. You can go AFK. It doesn't really matter. Then you get to content where you have multiple damage mods, plus something like pen or minus max res. These stats are the worst for us because it counteracts our greatest defense, which is our high max resistance. So for example, I tested Simulacrums. Simulacrums, it could pretty easily go to wave 30, not much of a problem. Until one time I got both Cold Pen, Ellie Pen, and gained 200% Fizz Extra Cold. It was gained 180%, but the point is there was a combination of two of the worst possible mods for me, which is double penetration and then gain mod on top of that. And that's the zone where I basically got killed, and then I was like, I don't really want to go back in there because I'm trying to level this character, because I probably would have died a couple more times, to be honest, because those mods, so like, they work so perfectly together to counter one of my main defenses, which was a high max resistance. So that's basically the main map mods you have to look out for, is pen minus max. You can run maps with it, but if you get too many damage mods like that combo together perfectly, then it starts to get dangerous. Cirrus Meteor, this is basically just if you pop Molten Shell. I think maybe you can even just do a Frost Shield and you'll tank Cirrus Meteor from Awakener 9. It's a heavy hit, but it's still one of the easier ones to tank. That one wasn't much of an issue. We did Maven Memory Game. I think this one we needed Molten Shell and Frost Shield and Flasks. We maybe could have got away with just Molten Shell and Flasks. I'm not sure, but that one's usually a pretty tough one. But we could pretty much do it 100% of the time if we procced our Molten Shell, Frost Shield, and Flasks. Then you have the El Double Uber Atziri Flame Blast. This is one I didn't really think we were going to be able to do going into it, because that comes with penetration on it. The double Uber Atziri Flame Blast, they hit very, very hard. We could survive about 70% of the time. I think I tested tanking them like 10 times, and I tanked them like 7 times and died 3 times, something like that. We could usually tank it if we set up our Molten Shell or Frost Shield or Flasks, stuff like that. And then Maven Brain Bomb. This is when the giant brain floats into the circle or whatever, has a big expanding circle. That we were never able to successfully tank. I think this is probably the hardest hit in the game, at least from my testing when I've tried to find big heavy hits. I've always found that this one was the hardest to survive. So that's kind of the breakdown of what you can and cannot tank with this build. Special shout out to Shaper Balls. Those things come with like 25 penetration, so they're actually one of the more dangerous attacks to us. In direct comparison with something like the Elder Spears that the Elder shoots out, those don't even phase us. But Shaper Balls, those things hurt. You have to you can't really just tank those continuously. So that's the main stuff you have to be concerned with this build. For the most part, basically all content, 99% of it, you just can AFK it for the majority of it. So that is the breakdown there. All right, now in game, let's go over what our character ended up with. Of course, it's Aegis Aurora. I go over this in the previous video. It's basically you stack some block, some glancing blows, a chance to block, and then you stack a bunch of armor. Our character has about 85k without flasks. With flask, we go up to 111k. With something like Molten Shell, we go to 120k. That means, you know, during mapping, flasks are always up. We have about 111k. We get about 2k ES every time we block, which is something like 60% of the time for attacking spells, I think. And then we are stacking a decent amount of aura effect with the character to get about 100% aura effect. That way we can get a lot of fizz reduction and regen from Unwavering Faith, as well as get a lot of benefit out of our auras like Zealotry, like Determination, like Hatred, for a lot of like basically damage scaling is what this character is going for. Other things we do with this character is we get Harmony of Purpose, which I didn't realize at the time, but it's a really nice quality of life to not have enemies generate charges, whether it be endurance charges, which would make maps a lot harder to complete because that's 45 all res, or if it's something like frenzy charges, it makes them a lot less dangerous. And then time of need, don't have to care about curses. So there's a lot of like map mods we don't have to care about, which feels kind of good. Other things we're doing with the character is we're basically pathing through this area because we want to get to Divine Shield. We want to have a good basically area to pick up some decks for Brutal Restraint, along with getting Aura Effect. We divine this. You really only need one 8% Aura Effect node, and then you can grab the 6% here to get to 100% Aura Effect. I ended up hitting it for an El Double one where I got 16% Aura Effect, in which case I could drop this passive. But really, you can get actually like one Aura Effect with other good mods, because my mods here, Evasion Rating, I think Minion Damage, those don't really help me. You okay, baby girl? I'm gonna take care of her. I'll be right back. So after pathing through here for Divine Shield, Glancing Blows, we're coming basically around the tree to get nice nodes like Arcane, Guardian for a lot of spell block. as well as things like Crit Multi here and Arcane Potency, along with increased non-damaging ailment effect. I pick up this sort of thing around the tree, both here and on the Elemental Mastery here, as well as the small notable here. Increased ailment effect is something that we've been given in abundance we didn't have access to before, which I think works really good in synergy with Leadership's Price. You can scale your Scorch, you can scale your Brittle, you can scale your Sap, you can scale all those things quite high from my experience, and it really ends up being a nice both offensive tool and defensive tool with Sap itself. When you're in boss fights attacking them, making them deal 20% less damage, it helps out a lot. Now, going through the rest of the tree, basically we're just grabbing some Aura Effect, ES, Aura Effect. Unnatural Instinct here is for the accuracy and attack speed to try to get closer to that 10.1 break point in attacks per second. I think we get to, with this character setup, we get about to 9.5. I think there's some things we probably could do better to get a little bit higher, closer to the 10.1 break point, but I'm just not interested in min-maxing it that hard. I'm happy with where it's at. The damage is fine. It feels great while playing, and I'm just good with it. Then we go through, of course, to get low life, because we are using Shavron's Wrappings. We're stacking some auras. We're reserving our life. Stuff like that. Feels good all the way up to here for a +3 on our crit support gem, which allows us to take our level 6 Awaken Cast on crit to level 9, which gives 34% CDR, which in combination with a belt of at least 18% or higher can get us to the 52% cooldown reduction breakpoint we need to hit in order to proc more casts from Cast on Crit. And then of course Aura Effect here, as well as a medium or a large cluster here. This large cluster, we wanted Mage Hunter and we wanted Conjured Wall, so that way if we're casting spells we can get our block chance a little bit higher with our spell block. You'll see normally we're at about 50% spell block. When we cast our spells, we go to about 62% spell block. Obviously, we would like to ideally get to something like 75, but I just haven't been able to fit that much additional block into the build, / it really hasn't felt that necessary, although it would be a nice upgrade. And then we have Thaumaphage here, or I'm not sure how to say this. This I ended up picking up very late, but it gives Spell Leech and a little bit of spell damage, which I think ends up feeling pretty good for the build, along with Aura Effect Cluster or Aura Reservation clusters here and here. One Introspection is necessary to get 100% Aura Effect, and then the crit cluster we use is Pressure Points. I think this is always a good idea in a build where you're trying to inflict heavy ailments to just have at least one source of percent double damage. That means occasionally you'll hit a boss with double damage. That will inflict a bigger ailment than your non-double damage hits. And I think it's really a good thing to include if you have a build that maybe hits faster, but it doesn't hit as hard. Then having a little bit of double damage in there, occasionally you'll hit harder and you'll have more constant effect of those better ailments. And then our next node here is Overwhelming Malice. This is another thing similar to the double damage node, is basically once you grab the Unholy Might from the 10% chance to crit, which we'll have up pretty much constantly. We're hitting so much, it's very often we'll keep this at 100% uptime. And then that, since we have a Conflux, which we have Brittle, Sap, Scourge Conflux, that means all damage will inflict this ailment. That means this 30% gain Fizz is Chaos. That extra Chaos damage will count for inflicting a better ailment, as well as just some additional damage to the build, given we are a Fizz spell. If you decided, and you can do this, if you wanted to do a spell that is not a physical spell, if you want to do Lightning, Cold, a Fire spell, you would swap Overwhelming Malice out for something else, probably Savage Response, I think. The one that gives you crit multi if you've blocked recently, that's probably the best one to use. And you'd also swap out something like, if you're doing a Fire spell, you'd swap out Hatred for Anger. Or if you're doing a Lightning spell, you'd swap out Hatred for Wrath. You get the idea. There's a lot of versatility in this build. It's pretty much all generic scaling. I'm not spec'd into one specific element or scaling type. So say Bladefall isn't your thing, you can go ahead and you can do a different spell. I ended up doing some Wave of Conviction a little bit for Uber Atziri just because Bladefall would hit too much of the arena and I would kill myself to reflect on the Mirror Clone. So I'd swap in Wave of Conviction to do Uber Atziri, for example, and it worked great. So really, just if there's other spells you like more than Bladefall, if Bladefall's visual isn't your thing, you can play around with the system. I'm sure there's maybe even better spells in terms of DPS, or, you know, there's other options. I didn't really test many others out. I just mostly went with Bladefall and thought, yeah, that feels pretty good. And that's just what I stuck with. So that, I think, gives a pretty good idea of what we're doing mostly on the tree here. Another thing I forgot to mention, and one of the biggest reasons why I chose Guardian, is Radiant Faith. One of the big things when I wanted to scale and have a big Aegis Aurora recover ES on block is Radiant Faith gives 160% of your life pool that you have reserved as armor. So from our 2200 life pool here, we're getting something like 3500 armor, something like that. It's a pretty substantial amount of flat armor we're getting. That allows us to scale quite a decent amount of armor into our build. You'll see if I do something like my Granite Flask here on number 4, we go from 85k to 97k. That's 1500 base armor, and if you're thinking we're getting almost double that, clearly this is contributing something like 30k armor. I'm not sure exact numbers, but it's a lot of armor we are getting from Radiant Faith, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to build around Guardian. Not to mention it has other great nodes like Harmony of Purpose, like Time of Need, like Unwavering Faith. These are all great, both defensive and a little bit offensive node here, and I want to just give Guardian some love because I think it's a solid ascendancy. I, of course, have named my character Revert Guardian because I've been salty for a long time now because Guardian used to be one of my favorite ascendancies. I love to build Righteous Fire with it. And basically, as far as I can tell, what happened is mana bots were strong, so let's screw over all the solo Guardian players. Because the Guardians I didn't think were completely overpowered. Maybe they were, maybe they deserved it. Clearly, I've made a pretty strong build here, but this also took quite a bit of investment and cost. So, I don't know. I'm gonna keep calling my Guardians Revert Guardian because I'm still salty about it. Maybe eventually I'll recover. So anyways, that is the overall on the character passives and why I was speccing and what I was doing. Now, when it comes to the actual setup of the character, it has been very tricky. Basically, every time I switch a gear piece or something around, I end up getting a headache because of Leadership's Price. Leadership's Price is great because it gives you the sapping, brittle Scourge conflicts, but it requires that your two highest attributes have to be equal to each other. So for me right now, I have 216 int and 216 dex. This could be strength int, this could be dex strength, depending on how your gearing goes. You just kind of have to work with what you got, and every time you swap a gear piece out that maybe changes your attributes, you have to re-figure out how to fix your attributes without breaking your build, and it's kind of a headache to build around. And it's part of the reason why I don't really want to make a full guide out of this, because even if you're following my guide, this is going to be a problem based on any random gear piece you add in and out that give you more dex than I have, or more strength than I have, or more int than I have, and it's basically like, it works great when you have it set up, but it's a little bit of a pain to get it set up in the first place, and it's just a rough time. So, moral of the story is, Leadership's Price is a cool item, but it's a pain to work with, and I had issues basically matching my attributes every time I would swap nodes around. The majority of the setup here is basically, we have unique items that we're guaranteed we're going to keep in the build, I think are worthwhile, are Aegis Aurora, Crown of the Inward Eye, and Chevron's Wrappings. These, oh, and Leadership's Price. These are basically mandatory in my opinion. I think they're very much the correct play to do in this build based on the stats they give us, how they work and synergize together. Lori's Lantern, I would say, isn't quite as mandatory. It's a great defensive ring. You could honestly go for a more offensive ring, like a Assassin's Mark on hit, something with a lot of cool rolls on it. I, frankly, was a little bit lazy and tired of re-gearing my character, and I thought, Lori's Lantern with a bleed implicit, that's cheap, it's good, and I'm going to put it on, and I'm not going to worry about crafting another item, because I was worried if I started crafting another item, I was going to get an item that had dex, or int, or strength, and it was going to ruin the balance of everything, and then I was going to have a headache again, and I didn't want to think about it. So I just threw on a Lori's Lantern, which is a good item, but you could also go with other options. This isn't completely, like, mandatory or anything. It's just the setup I went with because of the circumstances. As for boots, you want to go with Ailment Effect, and Awakener Orb that with Tailwind. Now, if your character, I've had a lot of people ask, like, hey, yo, what if I want to do with this with Mageblood, with Headhunter? You can use those items, but if you do, you need CDR on your boots. Because to get the 52% CDR, you need 18% CDR on either your boots or your belt. So if you swap out your belt, the CDR needs to be on your boots. So take that information if you will. If you want to replicate this and just throw on an OP belt, you can do that. Mage Blood, Headhunter, they would definitely be stronger than my rare belt here. I have no doubts about that in my mind. One thing I should mention that is very important is reduced mana enchant, 100% mandatory for the build. The way I've built this character is a lot of reduced mana sources, so that way we can afford our Cyclone, we can afford our cast on crit, and it isn't overpoweringly expensive. A combination of Insightfulness for 10% reduced mana cost here, the reduced mana nodes here give us about another, I think, 13%, so 23% total between these tree nodes. Then from the boots, we get another 18%. That takes us to 41, I believe. Then from our flask, 25 there takes us to 66% reduced. And then if you look at inspiration, it gives 36% reduced. So we get 100% reduced mana cost just from these sources. Now, you may think, hey, that bricks inspiration. It would if I still had the Divergent inspiration, which had another 10% reduced cost. But luckily, the way it kind of ends up working out is every time an enemy hits us, we'll go below full energy shield for a split second, and our Cyclone will tick, and it will give us a inspiration charge, so we'll keep our inspiration charges up. But occasionally, we'll basically have no mana cost on anything if all those things are up, if that makes sense, between the inspiration, between all that stuff. Or other things that we have, like a Frost Shield, for example, you see currently we can't cast it. If we have our reduced mana cost here, then we can cast it. Stuff like that, based on the reservation space we have, it's real tight. It is very extremely uncomfortable to get all this together and fit in, but once you get it set up, it works pretty well. One thing I should mention is part of the reason this build is so expensive is because of the mana reservation cost. I'm not sure if 50% would be the right estimate, but it's up there in terms of cost of the things that add cost to the build is getting the reservation right. Enlighten 4, Unnatural Instinct with reservation, and then getting a small node with 8% reservation. All these things are very big ticket cost items. I think in this build I have somewhere in the range of 120 to 160x. That's my personal estimate based on the currency I had when I started putting this together, and then things I've taken in and taken out and all that sort of stuff. But if you want to take that cost down and chop 50x off of it, I think the underlying cost of that is taking Zealotry out of the build. I think you have to free up some of that reservation space in order to drop the Enlightens, drop the Unnatural Instinct, Super Corruption, stuff like that you're going to have to look into doing if you wanted to start making this more affordable. Other things you'll have to do is maybe get a little bit worse of a corruption on your Shavron's Wrappings, get a worse Scepter, and get a worse set of rares, basically. Majority of the cost is the double corruption on the Chavrons, it is the Enlightens, it is the reservation cluster, it's the corrupted and unnatural instinct. You technically will be able to get a functional version of this build going, but you have to start cutting things off. I don't think I'm going to end up making a basically budget version of this character because I'm starting to get burnt out on the league and starting to do like other grind setups where I have to switch everything out and balance the attributes. I just don't want to think about it. I've already done it like 4 times with this character. And to be honest, I'm tired of doing it. I'm getting a little bit burnt out on redoing all the gear, rematching the attributes, stuff like that. So that's something to keep in mind. If you do think, I don't quite have 100x, I have 50x, 40x, 30x, whatever it is to work with, you can get it better. You can get a lot less expensive setup than I have here, but you're gonna have to drop things like Zealotry. Oh, Awaken Cast on Crit. This didn't even occur to me. This is a huge expense. You're gonna have to probably drop a high level Awaken Cast on Crit. That's a super expensive thing that was kind of RNG for me to corrupt. Stuff like that. You're basically gonna have to cut. You're gonna have to cut damage is the main thing I would predict if you start cutting out stuff, and you have to start just buying rares rather than self-crafting rares. I will go over in the POB of this character. I'll give some instructions on how to craft the pieces I crafted, like my scepter, like my ring, like my belt, like my gloves. But outside of that, it's going to be up to you whether or not you want to take on the risk of putting this build together, how much you can calculate, how much you think it's going to cost, what you have to work with currency-wise. But I'm just a little bit too burnt out to put together a cheap version of the build and stuff like that. So take that information how you will. I think that goes over the setup of the character. Flasks I should go over real quickly. Flasks are all about the gain charge when hit mod. I have it on every single Flasks. Basically how it works is we're planning on enemies hitting us. If they hit us, we have full uptime on Flasks, and basically in every boss fight, this gives you full uptime on Flask if you're tanking stuff, which we do. We constantly tank stuff. And then we just get extra affixes. I went with the Bismuth Flask, not because we need the all res, it's not capping a res or anything like that, but I'm using this because it's 15 charges and it has the longest duration. This is just the easiest flask I can think of to have 100% uptime on my reduced mana cost, because without the reduced mana cost, we don't cast spells. So that's why I chose Bismuth, because it's pretty easy to guarantee we'll have uptime on this flask over all the other options out there. If you want to do a little bit more min-maxing, you probably can go with a different flask besides this one, but that's the reasons I went with this flask specifically. Ruby Flask with regen. This is just to make our Righteous Fire sustain a little bit better, give us more net regen, so to speak. A Diamond Flask, that is of course for helping cap our crit. I'm not sure if we need this or not. I never ran the numbers. I don't know. But then we have the chance to avoid stun during Flask. This was my plan for dealing with stun. I didn't feel like stun was too big of a deal once I had that Flask mod. And then I was going to get additional sources of... You know, I just realized I had tried out a different setup with a different Watcher's Eye. There it is. This is the Watcher's Eye I meant to have in for all the previews of fighting and doing stuff with this character, but I had this one on. Anyways, you can roll Harvest, chance to avoid stun, and my plan was to get multiple implicits with chance to avoid stun. That was my stun immunity plan, but of course I never follow through with that because I never play a character long enough to encounter enough Harvests to get those implicits, so to speak. If you're min-maxing a character the whole league, though, that's something you probably can reliably do. So that was why we have chance to avoid there. And then the other flask affixes are percent armor and percent movement speed. It doesn't really matter which flasks have which suffixes, except for the Bismuth Flask. That's the one you for sure want the reduced mana cost on. If you're wondering where you get these special highlighted crafted flask affixes, you have to unveil them from the Katarina Cinder Swallow Flask. I know I've had people ask about that in the past when I've had the regen mod on my Flasks for Righteous Fire build, so I thought I should talk about that here. For bandits, or for Pantheon I should say, we will go with Brine King to get Cannot Be Frozen, reduced effective chill. You can also roll reduced effective chill on Jewel implicits as well as reduced effective shock. So because we drop Purity of Elements to get a single purity of all the different types, you end up wanting reduced effective shock, reduced effective chill. Things like Scourge don't matter because we're way over capped on Delirium, because we'll always have these flasks up and we get a bunch of all res, a bunch of fire res. Scorch Brittle, non-issue. Sap, it's kind of like we just deal less damage if we're sapped. But the one thing we truly aren't really very resistant to is Ignite. Now, Ignite technically just doesn't deal that much damage to us, and I haven't ever noticed dying to Ignite, except for one instance, which is Atziri Flame Blast. Apparently, believe it or not, those things inflict pretty big ignites, and I did die, I think, twice to tanking Atziri Double Flame Blast to tank it, to then die to the Ignite after the fact, which was kind of funny, because I had always told myself, I'm not going to die to Ignite, I have 88 max all res for fire, I'm fine. And then I go to die to Atziri Flame Blast. Most things aren't going to ignite you that hard, but it is possible. So, I think that covers the majority of the character. Hopefully I have explained everything well enough. As for, like, aura, gem setups, all that sort of stuff, it's going to be in the POB. And you have to do with that what you will. I don't recommend this as a character just because the awkwardness of setting up leadership's price and all the other things that have to coincide between accuracy, cast, and crit, and all that stuff. But the POB will be there if you want to try to hunt it down and put it all together. Anyways, as always, hopefully you guys enjoyed this character. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Take care, Exiles.